But for these kids, it's a little bit more difficult.
Because of people like you, Helen. Like, people like you make it so difficult for these trans people to exist and to be happy and to be able to access the medical care that they need and benefit immensely from. You're the reason why they struggle so much. Oh my gosh, Raymond, do not scratch me, please. He does not know that that is himself, because cats are silly little goopy goobers. Richard Dawkins, many people may be familiar, did a lot of work promoting science education, humanism, skepticism, particularly regarding evolution, atheism. He's had a little bit of a sus turn lately on trans rights and on trans people, and it just shows how flawed his reasoning is and how he is weaponizing bad views of biology in order to harm trans people. And I wanted to talk about it because the rhetoric that he's spewing is very similar to the rhetoric spewed by a lot of these transphobic pseudo-biologists, types like Colin Wright, types like Dr. Deborah So, where essentially they take a very narrow and limited view about biology that is not even reflecting the true objective reality of how our biology works, and weaponizing that to hurt trans people. They have to pretend that trans people conflate sex and gender. They have to pretend that intersex people either don't exist or are entirely insignificant to how we are going to categorize and understand human biology. They're just doing this to harm trans people, which is so strange, because if you care about biology, then why would you care if a trans person wants to express their gender in a way that is different than their biology? Like, why would that affect you if you just care about, like, what is true about biology? Richard Dawkins' recent turn started with him doing this podcast episode with Helen Joyce. For those that don't know Helen Joyce, she is a major figure in the anti-trans movement. She has gone on the record saying that trans people pose a serious threat to a quote-unquote sane society, saying that she believes the government must morally and legally mandate measures to reduce the number of trans people that transition. It is just insane that Dawkins would extend his platform to somebody whose entire advocacy is about harming trans people and their right to exist, if what he cares about is science, truth, objectivity. And it goes further, because recently, actually, just as of today, he did another episode of this same podcast series with Dr. Jordan Peterson about how wokeism is a new religion, weaponizing his atheist rhetoric to say that believing in, I don't know what he means by woke. Does he mean that, like, the idea that trans people exist? Does he mean the idea that, like, there are societal systems which marginalize people and that we could address them to make the world work better for everyone, be it poor people or people that have darker skin or trans people or what? Like, I don't know what he means by wokeness as a religion, but this is absolutely crazy in terms of a shift, and joining on the sides of Jordan Peterson, Helen Joyce, is really scary. So I wanted to get into, he had this video with Helen Joyce, as well as an article he talked about why he believes biological sex is binary. And so we're going to get into it and debunk some of this terrible rhetoric. Let's go.
Which is a very odd phenomenon, because I'm used to continua wherever I look. I mean, there's tall versus short, fat versus thin, old versus young. All these things are a smooth continuum. The one thing that isn't is sex. I mean, sex really is binary. There's no question about it. You're either male or female, and it's absolutely clear.
It's so crazy that he would say this when he also acknowledges that intersex people are a real phenomenon. Like, why couldn't we say, okay, so there's a spectrum between short and tall and varying shades of average height in between. Why can't we also say that, you know, there is these extremes of male and female and a spectrum of intersex conditions and intersex characteristics in between? Like, why can't we also call that a spectrum? What does he have to say that means we can't call it a spectrum? And he actually laid out his argument in his article that he did, where he says sex is a true binary. He talks about how we have two types of gametes, sperm and eggs, and then goes on to talk about various estimates of intersex people, saying that they range from higher estimates of 1.7% to lower estimates of 0.02%. And then he says that we can say that sex is binary because genuine intersexes are way too rare to challenge the statement that sex is binary. There are two sexes in mammals, and that's that. So apparently, if deviations from a binary are less than like a 1% or something, then it's still a binary? That's the logic he's applying. But this logic falls apart immediately when we think about elements of the universe. So we have an entire periodic table of elements hydrogen, helium, oxygen, iron, all the elements in the universe. What's really interesting is that if we apply his exact same logic, then the periodic table should be a binary. Elements should be binary. You can look up various physics websites, lectures, etc., but it is known, it is true, that depending on how we are going to estimate the proportion of atoms in the universe, we're going to get something ranging between 75% hydrogen, 25% helium, to 70% hydrogen, 28% helium, where the rest of the elements in the universe make up between less than 1 to 2% or less than, 0.01% of atoms in the universe. If we can accurately say that the universe is 75% hydrogen, 25% helium, and only 0.01% all of the other elements in the universe, then by this logic, elements of the universe are binary. But that makes no sense, because oxygen is a real element. It matters for our lives. Carbon's a real element. Iron matters. Gold matters. All of these elements, be they extremely rare, are real, they exist, and they matter. And so it's ludicrous to suggest that elements in the universe or the periodic table is a binary. And the same thing is true about intersex people. Sex is not a binary. Intersex people are real.
You can do it on gamete size, you can do it on chromosomes. And so it is, to me, as a biologist, distinctly weird.
Also interesting, he says that you can do binary sexes along the lines of chromosomes, when there are more chromosomal combinations than XX, XY that exist in humans. Actually, talking about spectrums again, there's even the phenomenon of chromosomal mosaicism, where somebody can be born such that different cells across different regions of their body have different sex chromosomes. These are called intersex chimeras in the medical literature, where maybe if you took some tissue from like their arm over here, it would be XX chromosomes. Maybe you took some tissue from their face over here, it would be XY chromosomes. And these people can have literally any combination of reproductive sex organs based off of how those portions of their chromosomes laid out in their mosaicism. It's fascinating. Chromosomes form a wide spectrum across various humans, even if generally they fall into mostly hydrogen, helium.
People can simply declare, I am a woman, though I have a penis. That seems to me to be a strange distortion of language, because language is useful as something to express your thoughts clearly.
So what's so strange is that the assumption that he's making right here, if you say, I am a woman, then you are claiming something along the lines of, I have XX chromosomes, or I have a vagina, or I have eggs, or I produce large gametes. But when trans people claim to be women, they aren't claiming any of those things, and they don't believe any of those things about themselves. When I say that I'm a woman, I know that I have a penis. I know that I was born with biologically male sex characteristics. I know that I underwent medical transition, and this has changed some of my sex characteristics. I'm not denying anything about biology. I'm just using woman as a social category, which is pretty common for how we typically understand and perceive women in society. When you see someone at the store and you think, oh, that person's a woman, you didn't look at their chromosomes to make that determination. You didn't look at their gametes. That's really weird. We don't do that in society. We generally observe how they present themselves socially, and we recognize a social category. Largely speaking, that's how gender works in descriptive reality. And so to weaponize this bad understanding of biology to say that trans people are not talking about the societal phenomenon, but are lying about a biological phenomenon, just makes literally no sense when we understand how we actually use gender.
Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, about particularly focusing on young girls and how they get misled.
These books that he's talking about were just very misleading cases where they interviewed a couple of detransitioners and tried to paint narratives about like detransition and transition not working that just massively skews the data, when we know that 99% of trans people are happy with their transition, are satisfied, do not detransition, when we also know that the overwhelming majority of people who do detransition do so only temporarily because they were bullied, because they were ostracized. That's literally what we know about detransition. These books are incredibly misleading, and citing them is horrible.
I listened to this on audio, so I don't have a physical copy of the books. I printed out look at the cover of
I
it.
printed out a cover of a transphobic book that I listened on audiobook. Crazy stuff to do, by the way. Like, that's actually crazy. Like, can you imagine being like, hey, I listened to this podcast about, like, race realism, and, like, how IQ disparities are, like, actually support my racist beliefs. And it's not because of, like, you know, socioeconomic issues, things like underfunding in black schools. No, it has to be based in genetic. Like, it can't have to do anything to do with funding or with, you know, problems that our society has created. Here's a picture of the podcast episode I watched about race realism. Insane stuff to do. Literally insane stuff to do. Like, isn't it really interesting how he doesn't cite a peer-reviewed study, he doesn't cite medical literature, he cites propaganda books and an audiobook that he listened to. The difference in evidence that he's presenting, where he doesn't have any kind of peer-reviewed study, he just has a couple of transphobic books written by known transphobes, is very telling that this is based in ideology and not science.
Lies behind this odd distortion of reality.
So that was basically the question that got me into this in the first place.
They always claim that there's some kind of distortion of reality or some kind of delusion or some kind of lie that trans people are telling, but they can never point out what that precisely is, because if you were to break it down, it falls apart instantly. Like he was saying earlier, someone can have a penis and say that they're a woman. Is this person who says I'm a woman claiming to have a vagina when they don't have a vagina? Because that's not happening. What this person is saying is that womanhood is more than just what's between your legs. And I hope that Dawkins would agree with that sentiment, but he has to absort and obscure that in order to make his point.
I mean, I've been thinking really almost full time about this for about 5 years now, and I don't have a pat answer for you. I think, like a lot of interesting phenomena, it's a lot of things. I would say that when I started to write about it first, I quickly realised that this wasn't treated the same way as anything else, like just asking very obvious questions. Like, don't you think that if we allow people to self-identify their sex, this will lead to, for example, destroying women's sports or putting in women's jails? People would turn this back on me and say, you think that trans people are predators, or you think that trans people are in bad faith, you're a bigot.
First off, those arguments do show that that is what you're believing in. And also, you can accept trans people while also placing measures to prevent people weaponizing bad faith self-ID. So, for example, if we're talking about sports, what we can do is we can actually, like, measure people's hormone levels. We can follow policies that are established by sports medicine scientists to ensure the best degree of inclusivity and fairness possible for all people, be they male, female, intersex, transsexual. That's what we're trying to do in order to, you know, mitigate any potential harms of bad faith actors, of which I don't think anybody can point to a single example of a genuine bad faith actor in the realm of trans sports. Is there any evidence or any case of somebody who literally was like, I'm just transitioning to be able to play in women's sports so I can dominate women's sports, and actually doing that? Because this has never happened. They always like to pretend that this is what's happening or that this is what's going to happen, but there are no examples of somebody transitioning for the sole purpose of destroying women's sports, which shows that she is just assuming bad faith, and she's assuming things that are happening that are not happening. And if you want to talk about, like, prisons and SA, you can have special facilities for people who have committed SA that are apart from men and or women. You can have systems such that you have some kind of, like, documentation, be it legal or medical, before you're able to go into, say, like, a female prison if you're trans. Like, you can have systems that stop bad faith actors from abusing the system while also accepting trans people. So she's making a slippery slope argument here. We can accept trans people and we can deal with bad faith actors. Accepting trans people does not mean we can't do anything about bad faith actors. That's the slippery slope she's trying to create.
And I hadn't experienced this before at that point, about 14 years as a journalist.
That's a willful misunderstanding. And
Yes, it is. It is willful misunderstanding. And I mean, I slowly became aware that what we were talking about here was an intensely linguistic movement. Like, there isn't a sense in which a man can become a woman except linguistically. Like, yes, okay, he can have operations, and some people do. Most trans people don't have any operations, don't take any medicine, don't have any genital surgery. But that doesn't change your sex.
Right. And people that don't take medicine and don't receive surgery don't believe they've altered their sex. They just believe that their gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth, and that they want to express that gender identity differently. What's the problem with that? She's not going to be able to answer that because she has to abstract and lie.
And the reason the female eunuch is called that is that Germaine Greer was pointing at the way that the man is seen as the full human and the woman is seen as the lacking human. She is a female eunuch. She's a man that you've castrated. But actually, female people aren't male people lacking something, or male people lacking something with a little grow bag that you pop a baby out of every now and then. Female people are their own category. Female and male are actually very profound categories. They're profound biological, evolved categories.
Well, evolutionarily, they have to be. The gift of giving birth is something that pervades the whole anatomy and physiology and psychology, actually.
Exactly. And if you're a mammal, every part of your body is female. Earthworms have both parts, Yes. But, my hands are female, my jaw is female.
Okay, so first off, what does it mean that your hands are female? Do you mean that, estrogen has effects which cause hands to, I know for, women's skin, it's, less veiny, more smooth, whereas, with men's skin, your hands tend to be, more veiny and less smooth. If that's what she's referring to, trans females also get hands that become less veiny and more smooth like women. Is she talking about the chromosomes of of the cells of people's hands? Because nobody sees that, and also there are so many intersex people who would disprove this simple binary you're trying to create.
Have you seen this Naomi TikTok?
That's such a weird point to be my hands are female. Take that, transgenders. When if we're talking about the phenotypic characteristics, trans people who are on HRT do obtain the phenotypic characteristics of the other sex with respect to hands, if that's the line we're trying to draw. And if we're talking about chromosomes, trans people don't believe anything false about their chromosomes. They just don't think that their chromosomes are all that important for how they should live their life socially, because chromosomes you can't see. They don't really matter to society. They really only matter between you and your doctor.
It's not just that I have, I'm a man with a uterus popped in and no penis.
You're not just a man with a uterus and a penis popped in. I mean, we know that human beings, as they develop in utero, start out as sexless templates, which are closer to female than male. Yet it is in responses to hormones that are determined by certain genetic factors and certain environmental factors that these hormones are going to cause you to develop either penis, vagina, uterus. It's actually the inside of the urethra that's analogous to the uterus. But essentially, all of the genetic material can develop in one direction or the other, in different parts with some intersex conditions. But essentially, they all come from the same initial structures. Every reproductive organ in a male body has a homologous structure to a reproductive organ in the female body. For example, the testicle, or the scrotum is homologous to the labia. The glands of the penis is homologous to the clitoris. We can talk about how the vagina is homologous to the internal structure of the penis. I know the prostate and the cervix are homologous. Literally every structure. There's Wikipedia tables that show that yes, every single one of these male or female body parts started out as the same structures in utero as a fetus that just developed in one direction or the other based off of hormones. So we kind of are sexless templates that just develop in one way or the other. She's literally just wrong about that.
The only sense in which a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man is by saying so. It's a speech utterance.
What about hormonally? You can hormonally change certain aspects of your sex beyond just linguistically. Literally hormones. Do hormones not actually change anything about you? Why would trans people take hormones if they don't change anything?
And so I've come to see, I think there are many things happening here. There's things happening in medicine, in politics. But one of the things that's happening is a long run, maybe 2 or 3 century move towards seeing categories and classification as inherently oppressive. So people think, heteronormative is a bad thing. Or they think that, the traditional family is constraining. And they miss the point that these things often, when I say evolved, I don't mean evolutionary biology. I mean that they came to be over significant amounts of time for a reason, and they're supportive as well as constraining. But everything that's structured or categorized or named or classified, that's now seen as something imposed upon people. So somebody like Judith Butler, for example, who's the queer theorist who wrote Gender Trouble, which is kind of the foundational text that academia uses when looking at these issues, says that gender is an imitation for which there is no original. That she doesn't see sex. She says sex is socially constructed and gender is...
Okay, so now we're getting into like the misrepresenting people. But if we're going to go to the point about whether or not like categories are inherently oppressive, I think we have to be really careful with how we navigate this, because it's a real nuanced topic. I don't think that the existence of categories is inherently oppressive. Like, we can label things as chairs without harming anybody. That's not inherently oppressive. Now, when harms start to arise is when we have a category and it's something that might work for some people or might even work for most people. However, if there are some people that it doesn't work for, then trying to impose that onto everybody, trying to say that this is the way you're supposed to be, the way you're supposed to act, the type of family you're supposed to have, the type of person you're supposed to date, when that's not actually what's right or best for you, that's where the harm starts to arise. When we try to impose something that is not universal, which you're not going to find any kind of imposition that really is universal in that way, when you try to impose people to do things because they're quote-unquote supposed to, even though it's not right for them, that's where the harm is. Now, as to her misrepresenting Judith Butler, when people say that sex is socially constructed, what they're referring to is the categorization of sex being socially constructed. We have two categories of sex, be it male-female, or different categories of sex. Maybe we include intersex as a separate category, that ultimately, in objective reality, there are sex characteristics. That is true. However, once we start to abstract that to male, female as discrete categories, we have to bias some characteristics over the other. So say somebody has XX chromosomes, but a penis. This happens sometimes. It's called de la Chapelle syndrome. Do we classify them as female because of their XX chromosomes, or do we classify them as male because they have a penis? We can also do this with other characteristics like hormones, like gonads, like gametes. There is a wide spectrum of intersex people that exist that have mixes of various sex characteristics, and where exactly we place them is going to be ultimately determined by humans who have our own biases and subjectivities that are going to influence how we determine things. Just looking through the history of sex categorization, we have had different systems proposed throughout all of human history. If we go back to like ancient Judaism and those societies, they believed that there was 6 different sexes, where they had 4 different intersex categories. There are some more modern interpretations that say there is 8, kind of in the Jewish sphere. We can go to, actually, in the early 90s, there was some sex research done by this biologist, Dr. Fausto Sterling, who did a lot of research on intersex people. Fantastic research. And she initially proposed a system where there was 5 sexes. There was kind of a male sex, a female sex, kind of a female-leaning intersex, kind of a male-leaning intersex, and kind of a more middling intersex. So that this system is better for categorizing people because, you know, female-leaning intersex people have some unique medical needs and biological functions that's kind of in between the more middling intersex cases and the more female cases. And then Dr. Fausto Sterling went on to say later, as she did more research on sex differentiation and intersex people, that her system of 5 sexes was also way too oversimplistic, because how do we categorize somebody who might have, say, hormones in one direction, but chromosomes in the other direction, genitals in one direction in terms of their external genitalia, internal genitalia in a different direction, that it was just far too all over the place and multifaceted, that even a 5 characteristic, or like a 5-class system, was not accurate enough at categorizing all people, be they male, female, intersex, or wherever they lie on the spectrum of characteristics. And so this is why biologists eventually settle on recognizing that, okay, this kind of binary notion of male-female is generally pretty good at sorting people into roughly one of 2 categories, but biological sex is so multifaceted, it covers multiple variables, that we can't really reduce it to a single variable or single continuum. Just trying to classify people by genitals is not enough. Just trying to classify people by hormones is not enough. Just trying to classify people by chromosomes is not enough. There are more than just one sex characteristic. And so that's why, if you've ever heard somebody say something like biological sex is a constellation, or biological sex is multifaceted, what they're meaning is that it composes multiple characteristics and they can kind of be all over the place. That's what's actually objectively true about biological sex. And whatever classification system we draw from that is going to be influenced by our biases and our beliefs. Just how, like, Richard Dawkins has a bias and a belief against trans people, towards simplicity, towards this binary notion that just doesn't exist in objective reality.
And there isn't any foundation for gender. It's just something that's made meaningful by performing it over and over again. Now, I hadn't come across this at university. As I say, I studied mathematics. And I spent my time proving theorems and defining my terms very carefully. So I was blissfully ignorant of the fact that significant numbers of young people are being taught this sort of nonsense.
If you think that you can explain, like, wide-scale sociological phenomenon using math equations, that is absolutely crazy. Like, the amount of consistency we would have in a math theorem versus a general sociological trend is completely backwards.
But they come out of it thinking that somebody who says, look, there are two sexes, and the sex that you are is the sex that you were conceived as, they think that what you're doing is imposing social roles on them. So I was brought up to think that what was liberatory and what was progressive was to say, well, this little person is a girl. Let's not let her stop. Let's not let that stop her doing anything.
Trans people also believe that. Trans people also believe that a girl can be an astronaut, and that, say, like, liking a Ken doll does not make you a boy. Like, trans people also do believe that gender nonconforming people are a real phenomenon, and that they're cool, and that they should be allowed to exist as they wish. Like, trans people also believe that.
I was brought up to think that you could do whatever you wanted to. You have the power to as you said, be an astronaut, be whatever you damn well like. And it's as though this trend now is reverting to stereotyped girls like pink and boys like blue, and boys like playing with Meccano sets and girls like playing with dolls. And it's a stereotyping which I kind of revolt against, and yet it seems to be increasingly fashionable.
How do trans people, like, mandate that being reinforced? Because those kind of stereotypes being weaponized against trans people is one of the major ways that trans people are harmed at large by society. Like the idea that, oh, if you're a trans woman, well, actually, you're supposed to just be a boy. You just have to do boy things. You just have to be a boy, act like a boy, live like a boy. Like, those are weaponized against trans people to hurt trans people. And so trans people largely dislike the societal expectation or enforcement of those gender stereotypes. They just want people to be happy, regardless of if they're boy, girl, non-binary, like trucks or dinosaurs or unicorns. Just, like, let people exist in this, multifaceted area of characteristics as whatever makes them happiest.
And just the old-fashioned stereotyping that would have said, look, this child is definitely a boy, and if he doesn't like rugby and so on, well, he's a pufter, and let's bully him. It's now saying he's actually a girl.
Yes.
Nobody's saying that. Literally nobody is saying it. If you, like, the world that the transphobes live in, they have to pretend that, like, the moment a little boy picks up a Barbie doll, that, like, big transgender immediately, like, storms his house, FBI raid, and, like, injects him with puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. Like, they're so delusional about, like, if somebody picks up a Barbie doll, then immediately the woke ideologues would be like, ah, transgender! When in more reality, what's actually happening is, okay, they're into some things that we might traditionally consider feminine expression. Let them do that. Let them have fun. If their gender identity, as it emerges, comes to be not that of a boy, then they should probably talk to a gender therapist about that. See what feels right, explore their options, and just do what's going to be best for them. Like, this idea that people are rushing to, like, label people as trans and that there is no room for exploration or gender nonconformity is just crazy when you think about how trans people actually interact with gender nonconformity and are harmed by attempts to make them gender conforming.
So, there's the pink and the blue boxes have been structured and remade and reinforced, and a child who doesn't fit into the one that's for the sex that they were, inverted commas, assigned at birth, we have to pop them into the other one. And if you call them out on this,
nobody's saying that.
They say, no, that's gender expression, that's gender roles you're talking about. We're talking about gender identity, which is a sort of posited, innate knowing that you pop into the world with. But nobody pops into the world knowing that sort of thing about themselves. Children learn it from the stereotypes. They self-examine and match themselves against the stereotypes. So now we say to little, what you used to call boy, that little boy now thinks that he's meant to be a girl.
If that were the case, then gender nonconforming trans people would not exist. Yet gender nonconforming trans people are a real phenomenon. I have met plenty of very masculine trans women. I have met plenty of very feminine trans men. Trans femboys? Very hot. You boys keep it up. You're doing God's work. Like, this notion that trans people always conform to gender stereotypes, or trans people are just somebody who is gender nonconforming, and then now that means they have to be trans, just ignores the reality of gender nonconforming trans people. So it's essentially, what we can show is that because gender nonconforming trans people exist, yes, there is a difference between gender identity and gender expression, even if we might think of them as related, which, yeah, there's a general correlation between someone's gender identity and someone's gender expression and someone's biological sex. These are all general correlations we can observe, but they can be different. And that's why we can have gender-conforming trans people. That's why we can have gender-non-conforming trans people. That's why we can have cis people who are gender-conforming, cis people who are gender-non-conforming. We can have intersex people, non-binary people. People can be all over the place, and those are all A-okay. The other really interesting assumption behind their line of reasoning right here is that being a trans person is intrinsically worse than being a gender nonconforming cis person. And so my question to that is, okay, suppose somebody, they can either be a girl who is gender nonconforming, a tomboy, etc., or they could be a non-binary person that expresses their gender in the exact same way. Either way, they don't want to go on hormones. What is the problem if some people like this see themselves as tomboys and that's how they understand themselves, but other people like this see themselves as non-binary and that's how they want to express themselves, that's how they identify? What's the problem with both of these types of people existing, even if largely they're pretty similar? Why is the non-binary one worse than the gender non-conforming one? Why can't they both exist? Neither of them are being medicalized because neither of them want hormones. So where's the problem with that? They can never point to a problem with that, because the problem with that they want you to assume is that trans bad. Like, you have to take that additional premise for this argument to even make any sense at all.
Teachers may say that's not what I'm telling him, but it is what they're telling him.
Yes, I was very upset to see evidence from your book and others that teachers and doctors perhaps are latching on to a child who expresses the slightest doubt about this and then it affirms them.
What's this evidence? Was the evidence one detransitioner that said that? Or was there, like, actual studies and whatnot? Like, what's the evidence he's talking about?
I mean, it's worse than that they latch onto it. They suggest sell it.
Yes.
You know, these books for 2 and 3 and 5-year-olds that say you must examine your gender.
Okay, if we're talking about children books that are saying examining your gender is a good thing, I've never seen a children book say that you must examine your gender. But what these books are doing is encouraging self-exploration, encouraging imagination, playing with identity, finding out what feels right. It is actually a very good exercise for children to explore their gender identity, to explore their gender expression, to do imaginative play. This is a very good exercise for kids. It can also have varying extents of reality or meaning or significance. Like, for some kids, they might play as an astronaut. They might have a really, really cool fixation with space and stars and whatnot. And as they grow up, they genuinely want to study, like, astrological science. Or maybe it's just a kid who thought that space was cool and they liked playing pretend as an astronaut for a little bit. And then as they grow up, it's just not really something that's all that important to them. The same can be true about kids exploring their gender. Like, there are some kids that might, you know, play as another gender, express themselves as another gender, and feel that feels really right. And that's a consistent, insistent, persistent part of their identity. Where other kids, maybe it's just an exercise of imagination. They play as a girl in some kind of imagination situation, and then they drop it because it's not really who they are. But they have the exercise of playing pretend, of exploring their identity, of exploring whether or not something feels right or wrong, and learning more about themselves. This is actually a really good exercise for kids to explore who they are, to figure out what feels right, and to figure out what they want to do and what they want to be as they grow older. And in a case where somebody has very insistent, consistent, persistent cross-gender identity, then they can talk to a therapist about that. And that's really all that the left is advocating for.
Here, a quote from a girl from America. I think she must have been about 12 when this happened to her. She says, I was in a very liberal school.
Oh, okay, so the evidence he has is one detransitioner talking. Okay, that's the evidence. Got it.
And she says there was so much peer pressure to either be gay or trans at this school. Basically, it felt like you weren't cool if you were heterosexual. This made me even question myself quite a few times, even though I'm heterosexual. I know that this pressure can be real for so many children. some of them may actually be gay or trans, and I will definitely support them and fight for them in the end. But that's pretty young to be labeling yourself in any permanent way, in my opinion.
That's crazy. Overwhelmingly, all data we have shows that gay people, and especially trans people, face increased bullying at schools. I mean, I know in my experience, when I was in high school, there was one trans kid that came out towards the end of my high school career, and they were bullied relentlessly for being trans. It was genuinely awful how this person was treated because people didn't understand them. To suggest that, like, being trans or gay is cool, when what we know from the objective reality of all of the studies we have on high school bullying and queer identity is that overwhelmingly being queer is a mark against you and is going to result in far more bullying and ostracization, is absolutely crazy. And also, like, if you're confident in your own heterosexual identity, cool. But at the same time, if you, like, thought about your heterosexual identity more and were like, maybe I'm bi-curious, or maybe I'm bisexual, or maybe I'm something else, you tried it, you realize that that's really not right for you, and you're like, yeah, okay, I tried something, it's not right for me, I'm definitely heterosexual. What's the problem with that? What's the problem with people being like, you know, I'm open to being surprised that maybe I actually am bisexual? They try something, they realize it's not right. As long as they're safe and comfortable in a healthy situation, I don't see any problem with somebody exploring their sexuality or their gender identity. Exploring and finding out who you are is a good thing. Being open to new experiences is a good thing. And knowing, hey, I tried something and I didn't like it, that's a good thing. You learn more about yourself.
She was a very bright girl. She's actually written books about science for children. And very, very impressive. And I was really depressed to read her letter. There is peer pressure and even teacher pressure to really go against reality.
Peer pressure and teacher pressure to go against reality. This is nothing but ideology and completely ascientific. We're taking one single anecdote of somebody who is probably not even telling the truth based on all available data we have on bullying in schools, and then we're extrapolating that to trans people are lying about their biology and that teachers are encouraging people to lie about their biology. This train of logical leaps is delusionally off the walls. Like, none of that makes any sense and is all against everything we know about the scientific literature, about what trans people actually believe about their biology, about bullying in high schools, about whether or not, like, trans people that are gender nonconforming exist. Like, everything they're saying is completely wrong when you look into anything in the actual peer-reviewed scientific literature, rather than a single anecdote by one person who is probably lying.
Yeah, absolutely. And teachers think that they're being progressive, you know? So in this country, we don't have a syllabus.
That's put very beautifully. Like, someone who is famous as, like, a pop science writer is now basing an entire worldview off of a single subjective source anecdote.
For relationships and sex ed, there's some sort of very vague things that you're meant to cover, like the facts about sex and gender identity, or the facts about sexual orientation and gender identity, without telling you what those facts are. I don't think there are any facts about gender identity.
Yeah, we can talk about facts about gender identity, like the fact that there exists people in society that express their gender identity along a spectrum. Some people are cisgender, some people are transgender, some people are non-binary. These are all types of people that exist, and that's a-okay. And those are the kinds of facts that you would want to teach to kids so that they don't bully trans people. Because we actually have peer-reviewed studies which show that when we teach this kind of diversity and acceptance education, that, hey, different types of people exist and that's okay, kids are less likely to get bullied and they perform better in school. Those are the facts, Helen.
Lobby groups that write unbelievably inaccurate materials and then sell them to schools. So I've seen short videos and they're so nicely made. There's one by a guy who calls himself Ollie, and his sidekick is a balloon, and they call themselves Pop and Ollie. And Pop and Ollie, you know, it's very bright and colourful, and they're like, your sex is the best guess that a doctor had when you were born. They looked at you and guessed.
That is true. So that's talking about intersex people, not trans people. But yes, actually it is the case that 75% of intersex people don't even know they're intersex, because often these intersex conditions are internal, where they don't have an external manifestation. Or they might even just think that what they're experiencing is not an intersex condition, but something else. It is absolutely true that when doctors write male or female on your birth certificate, they are making an educated guess that is right about 98% of the time. Like, you see how they make a statement about biological sex, specifically referring to intersex people, and then they disingenuously interpret it about gender. Like, they have to weaponize a disingenuous conflation of sex and gender in order to make this about trans people, and in order to make it false from their crazy worldview.
We're waiting for you.
Wait a minute.
They guess your sex.
You had a penis, and yet they guessed.
Yes. Yeah. So they often...
A doctor.
Well, think about this, Mr. Dawkins. Some people are born with penises and ovaries. This happens sometimes. By your definition of sex being based off of the gametes you produce, this person would have eggs and a penis. This has happened in the medical literature before. So yes, they guessed male because they saw a penis, but they had ovaries. If you want to base it in chromosomes, there are people that have XX chromosomes yet are born with a penis. There are people that have XY chromosomes yet are born with a vagina. These things happen. So yes, writing male or female on a birth certificate is a guess.
Conflate this fact that there are people who have differences or disorders of sex development, which is a tiny number of people. I mean, a few people do need investigations.
0.02%.
Exactly. And even then, you know, mostly they're getting investigated for conditions that don't cast doubt on their sex. It's just their genitals have not developed normally. Yeah. So, I mean, probably about half a dozen people a year in this country, in Britain, have their sex assigned at birth. The rest of us, the doctor writes it down.
Half a dozen people a year? How many live births in Britain? Okay, 624,000 live births. So we'll take that and we'll multiply it by the lowest estimate of like intersex people that are like in the very middling intersex category would be 0.02%. Even by the lowest estimate, more than 100 intersex people born every year in England. If we go with the higher estimate, 10,000 intersex people born every year in Britain. Yeah, she is very wrong about how many intersex people exist. When you have this level of scale, something that happens between 0.02 to 1.7% of the time happens a lot. It's a real phenomenon that exists.
The doctor guesses your sex, and then when you're old enough, you get the chance to tell everybody what sex you are.
So are you acknowledging that the statement that doctors make a guess about sex is real? Because intersex people like this do exist. So now they're getting mad at something and then walking back to agree with it.
Are you male, female, a boy or a girl, or something else in between? And then stars come behind him and it looks like you're going through the galaxy and it says, or something else entirely. And we get off this putative sex spectrum down here. What are you meant to make of this if you're 8? Like, right. First off, that you're very boring if you think that you're a boy or a girl.
Lots of 8-year-olds like being a boy or a girl.
No hints as to what this gender thing is. So you look around and you see Barbie and G.I. Joe and, you know, that sort of thing. And you say, well, I don't like Barbie. I might be a boy. It's incredibly regressive.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. But if somebody didn't like Barbie and were like, I think I might be a boy, and then they talk to a gender therapist about that, where would the harm be? Because the gender therapist would help them understand that, like, well, gender nonconforming people exist, non-binary people exist, trans people exist. These are all real types of people that exist, and we just want to help you figure out who you are and what's right for you. Actually, the studies we have show that most people who are referred to a gender therapist are just gender nonconforming cis kids. Like, if you've seen all of the the quote-unquote desistent studies that claim to show that, like, most trans people detransition, it's a weaponization of bad data. Essentially, they took everybody that was referred to a gender therapist, which turns out to be mostly gender nonconforming cis kids. So when gender nonconforming cis kids go to gender therapy, the gender therapist helps them come to terms with their gender nonconformity, and they turn out just fine and happy and healthy. Yet when a trans person does this, which is the rarer case, they're able to help them figure out what's right for them, how to manage their gender dysphoria. Maybe when they're older, that's going to involve some kind of medical treatment, which, by the way, the overwhelming majority of trans youth don't even medically transition. If you've looked at the data on trans youth, there was the Reuters data. Let me find that. It's actually really fascinating. Over the past 5 years, 121,000 gender dysphoria diagnoses, yet only 14,000 hormone prescriptions, only 4,000 puberty blocker prescriptions. It's only like 10% of the trans youth that are diagnosed with gender dysphoria even medically transition. What's the harm with somebody having a trans identity as just a better way of understanding and explaining their conceptualization and interaction with gender? Like, where's the harm in that? When 90% of them don't even go on to take any kind of medicine because they know it's not right for them. What's the problem with that? Like, the only problem that she can say is that trans bad or that detransitioners exist.
Somewhere in your book, there's a story about a mother who had 8 children, and she said, And not a single one of them is boring cis. Is that what she said?
That's right.
Yes.
So cis is this very new coinage that's by analogy with trans.
Yes.
Because what they don't want is you saying, real women and trans women, or normal women and trans women, or actual women and trans women. They want there to be two types of women.
We can do this with other types of conditions or types of ways that people exist. Having an objective term to refer to the majority class of people is a lot better than saying real or normal. We can do this with autistic versus allistic. Allistic is a retronym much like cisgender to refer to people who are not autistic. Saying things like autistic brains and real brains, or autistic brains and normal brains, or autistic brains and the brains the way that they're supposed to be, is really dehumanizing and discriminatory towards autistic people. And the same thing is true about this trying to say that, like, real women, trans women, like normal women, trans women. Yeah, like, can we not dehumanize people just because they're different from the majority? Like, that'd be cool, right?
So they need a symmetric word to trans, and that is cis.
Cis, yeah.
On the same side of.
Yes.
And so this woman, I found this quote in a closed Facebook group in America for parents of trans kids. Somebody gave me a password into it, and I lurked there for a while and watched. And there were gender doctors in there selling treatments, answering questions with extremely inaccurate information, like claiming that science has settled on things that it's not.
Like what? Can you point out some of the inaccurate information, or are you just going to say it's inaccurate?
You saw was the parents reinforcing each other's false beliefs.
No, okay.
So a new parent will come in and go, "Hi, my great little trans boy, which is a girl, she's 4. I'm learning so much from her." Sorry, I've forgotten which way around I'm having this child. Let's say it's really a girl, and this girl says she's a boy.
Holy yikes! The way that she's talking about this kid, like, that's just heinously, like, mean to be that just disparaging of someone's identity.
This guy, I'm learning so much from him, but I'm just wondering, like, I'm a bit worried about socially transitioning him in case I'm leading him on the path to medicalization, and then people will love bomb her and come in and say, "Wow, great to have you here with us."
Love bomb. That is what religious cults do.
Is he insinuating that, like, supporting someone is like being a religious cult? That's insane. So going to a Facebook support group for information and help and affirmation is not the same thing as a religious cult that is going to try to stop you from leaving or trying to stop you from exploring your options. Like, the whole point of seeing a gender therapist, which is the first line of defense for anybody who's seeking any kind of, like, transition-related healthcare, is to explore your options and to figure out what's right for you. Religious cults don't do that. That is insane to compare evidence-based medicine and exploratory therapy to a religious cult. Insanity.
Love bomb is the phrase they actually use, I think.
Yes, that's right. And then if you step out of line, if at any point you say, "Well, I'm not going to do whatever this thing is," and you are just going to get piled on and you'll get kicked out.
Yeah.
And the thing that these people use more than anything else is the emotional blackmail of telling you that if you don't get with the program, your child will kill themselves.
Now that is appalling because well, put it another way, the evidence for that.
So I'm guessing if we're talking about somebody who's getting kicked out of this group, like, are they being incredibly, incessantly transphobic, like, towards their kid? Because I could see how the group would not want that to exist. Like, being like, "I've decided my kid's identity isn't real and I'm not going to take them to a therapist. They should not be trans." Like, that's pretty awful if somebody's saying those kind of things, and they should probably not be in a trans supportive group. Because it doesn't seem like they're trying to do the purpose of the group, which is to support other people that have trans kids. Like, just disparaging your own kid's identity doesn't help anybody. So I think it is fair to bring up that untreated gender dysphoria is connected to a pretty strong increase in suicidality and self-harm. We can treat this with talking to a gender therapist, with, in some cases, 10% of cases, it seems, gender-affirming care. We can talk about these real statistics. I mean, you can do the same thing with depression. Like, if somebody was suffering from really severe depression, and then their parents were like, "Yeah, I just don't believe that depression is real, so I'm just not going to take them to a doctor. I'm not going to let them go on antidepressants. It's just not real," or whatever. Like, you can be rightfully mad that parents that do things like this are linked to increases in their kids killing themselves or otherwise harming themselves. And that's something that you can point out and rightfully be mad about. Like, evidence-based medical care saves lives. And that's true with antidepressants. That's true with gender-affirming care. Can't we just support people?
Now that is appalling because well, put it another way, the evidence for that had better be damn good. Otherwise, it is the most appalling blackmail. How good is the evidence? I mean, the evidence that it does lead to suicide.
He doesn't even know. He hasn't even looked at any kind of like studies or statistics on trans suicidality. How is he going on to like be such a voice against trans people when he doesn't even know anything about like data or efficacy of transition? That's awful.
So the important thing to understand is that the reason they say suicide, it's not just that it's emotional blackmail, it's that they're suggesting that you put your child on a pathway that leads to sterility. Because if you put a child on puberty blockers early in puberty, and then you put them on cross-sex hormones, at some point, we don't know exactly when, but maybe at 20 or 21, you've missed your opportunity. Your own sex organs are not going to grow. You are not going to be a person who can conceive or impregnate somebody else. So they're sterilizing children.
If the end goal is sterilizing children, which is so clearly not, because doctors are required to discuss fertility preservation with trans youth. All of the informed consent packets on medical transition is required to discuss fertility banking as an option. They encourage people to go to fertility banks. And like we can expand fertility banking and even like fertility banks within gender clinics. But the fact that they're required to do this shows that the goal is not to sterilize kids. Why would anybody want that to be their goal? That doesn't make sense at all. How can she claim that and people like actually believe that people just want to sterilize kids for no reason? Why would they offer fertility banking if that was their goal? It makes zero sense.
And the only reason you would ever do that is to save a child's life.
So it has to be...
Yeah, it has to be death. It has to be death or sterility.
Yes.
So that's why suicide. Now, there are not a lot of children committing suicide, thankfully. It's very, very rare in minors to commit suicide. So that's the first bit of evidence that this is not true. There's an enormous boom in trans identification. There has been no concomitant boom in suicide, again, thankfully. But there have actually been a few papers that have looked at children who are on the waiting list for gender clinics. And what they have found is that these children, they do have a lot of mental comorbidities, mental health comorbidities. So you are seeing higher rates of depression, anxiety.
Gender dysphoria is the cause of those other conditions. Like you find this time and time again, but trans people often do not benefit from just starting antidepressants because the cause of the depression is often the gender dysphoria. There are some trans people that genuinely do have, say, like gender dysphoria and depression, and it's helpful to treat both. But in most cases, based off the clinical data we have, it seems to be that when trans people are presenting with depression, it's actually a like a result of their gender dysphoria, and that the gender dysphoria is what they need to treat to cure the depression.
So that's there anyway, and they're
Yes.
depressed anyway, or
Yes.
or bulimic, or
they
something like that.
they say that of course that it's the stress, the minority stress that's causing these things, but there's no evidence that that's true.
We have so much evidence which shows that once trans people start to transition, rates of depression and anxiety decrease drastically. 60% lower odds of moderate to severe depression after starting their HRT or their puberty blockers. So like, yes, we do have evidence which shows that it is being caused by the gender dysphoria, the depression, and that alleviating the gender dysphoria alleviates the depression. We literally have data which shows
that a child who's looking for solutions to feeling miserable and is sold that if you're trans, you can reinvent yourself, you're like a phoenix, you'll rise from the ashes a new person, all your problems will be left behind. So yes, so the suicide rate is, and the self-harm rate is a little higher than it is in the general population, but not out of line for mental health conditions.
Yeah.
And important to say, there is literally no evidence that transitioning the child will decrease that risk.
We literally just showed a peer-reviewed study which demonstrated just that.
Yes.
Yet she says that no evidence exists. Okay.
So it does seem like terrible emotional blackmail. People like you who are standing up about this, and mostly women, I suppose.
I can't believe that like Richard Dawkins like literally doesn't have any kind of evidence or peer-reviewed literature backing on this topic. Like that is so wholly irresponsible when Helen Joyce is such a known liar and deceiver.
Seeing an awful lot of persecution. I think you're very brave. And J.K. Rowling's very brave. Kathleen Stock's very brave. Maya Forstater is very brave.
Is he just saying you're brave for being bigoted against trans people? Wild take. No, J.K. Rowling is not brave. Like, she name searches herself on Twitter and gets into arguments with random nobody Twitter accounts because that's like, she's so fragile. Like, she is not brave. Like, these people are incredibly fragile.
What gives you the courage?
I mean, I don't want to answer for anybody else, although I work with Maya daily, so I sort of see where she comes from in it. And I know Kathleen, and I've met Jo Rowling. It's my privilege to have met her. In my case, I was lucky to work somewhere that has a very collegiate and rigorously intellectual atmosphere, namely The Economist. But even there, of course, there were people who didn't agree that I should be speaking about this, and it was awkward on occasion. I would say in my case, I was in too deep, so far steeped in blood that there was no way back. Like before I knew that this was going to be a problem, I was so far in that I couldn't get back. And then I was quite negative about it. I really felt that something very bad was happening. And, all the people who think that something very bad is happening, they'll pick a different bit of it. They'll say it's about free speech, or it's about women's rights, or it's about children's health, or it's about just, basic reality or sanity.
Is she admitting that it's like a whole bunch of like disingenuous points that they don't actually care about? Because they're like all over the place and it's really not any of those? Is she admitting the grift here? Because yes, they all do these claims in bad faith. And you can just see this from the other policy positions they take.
Have you seen
like time and time again, the same Republicans that support like bans for transgender healthcare are also the same ones that like trying to legalize child marriage. We've seen multiple Republican state legislators that have tried to propose legislation banning transition healthcare for minors, and then go on to make legislation in the same session that would constitute child marriage. Like this keeps happening time and time again. They don't care about the children. And you can do this with all of the claims she just made. Like, she's really admitting the grift here.
And it was all of those things for me.
Oh, yeah. She says all of those things because all of the grift is better for her rhetoric. Got it.
Some detransitioners were speaking, and this would have been, I think, late 2019. And I found it a profoundly upsetting event. So at this one in particular, there were 6 young women. Of course, there are boys who transition and detransition too, but this was 6 young women, all of whom had thought they were boys. And they were all of them lesbians who had been misled by their early gender nonconformity into thinking they must be boys. And they had gone various stages down the medical pathway. And one of them, who was 23, was this very articulate young woman who had suffered from anorexia in her teens, and at 18 had stumbled upon the idea that she was trying to starve away her curves because she was meant to be a boy. And by 21, she had all her sex organs removed and was on testosterone. She had no breasts, no uterus, no ovaries. She had a beard, her hair was receding.
No ovaries? They don't typically remove people's ovaries. This is definitely very hyperbolic, and also just not the majority case of detransitioners. If you want to talk about like the actual data on detransitioners, overwhelmingly detransitioners are people who detransition only temporarily due to external pressures, like lack of funding to be able to actually purchase their hormones, such as being bullied relentlessly. Also, with like all the wait lists for medical transition, particularly surgeries, like this story it's really hard to get it to add up like that, where like you can get all those procedures done in the course of 2 years, when we know that like the wait lists for most gender affirming surgeries are 1 to 2 years. Like, this is just crazy.
And she still wasn't feeling any better. She still had an eating disorder. She one day had the thought, how can an operation, namely a hysterectomy, that only a woman can have, turn me into a man? And that bounced her all the way back to, I am a woman, that is just a fact about me.
What a dumb argument. There are certain like procedures that only an intersex person could have. This is a good analogy. Chemotherapy is a procedure that only somebody who is experiencing cancer can receive. And then after you go through chemotherapy, it destroys the cancer and you no longer have cancer. So what you were before the procedure, having cancer, versus what you are after the procedure, no longer having cancer, those can be different. Like, just because you got chemotherapy doesn't mean you still have cancer. That's not even good logic.
I have a very soft spot for gay kids. I have a gay son myself. He's never had gender dysphoria. It's important to say that. He's never had any theory that he's a girl or anything like that. But I have a soft spot for these kids because they're quite non-conforming, and finding your way as a teenager is difficult anyway, but for these kids it's a little bit more difficult.
Because of people like you, Helen. Like, people like you make it so difficult for these trans people to exist and to be happy and to be able to access the medical care that they need and benefit immensely from. You're the reason why they struggle so much.
Because as they're growing up, they're also realising they're different.
I mean, how many of these children do you think are just simply gay anyway?
Well, according to the Tavistock Clinic, which is the UK's main gender identity clinic for children, The great majority of the children they see are same-sex attracted. There's a strong statistical
So they could have
link.
been perfectly happy
Yes.
growing up as...
Yes.
He's saying so they could have been perfectly happy growing up gay or whatever. How does being gay mean you can't be trans? Like, a presumption of his logic right there is that if you're gay, you can't be trans. Like, trans people can be gay, trans people can be straight, trans people can be literally any sexuality. Gender identity and sexuality are not the same thing. What kind of logic is that? And if you look at things like the trans survey, you actually find like a very diverse spread of sexualities across trans people. So the stats on like trans people are predominantly gay or same-sex attracted or however you want to phrase it is actually just not true when you look at the broader samples of trans people.
Potentially healthy gay adults into sterile, straight simulacra of the opposite sex.
One of the points you make, I think, is that there are certain parents who would rather have a trans child than a gay child. And
Yes.
Where is this happening? Like, being trans is way more socially ostracized than being gay. Where is it happening that it is better to be trans than gay? Other than, like, Saudi Arabia or Iran. But, like, we're talking about the U.S. In the U.S., here in this culture, it is way more socially accepted to be gay than to be trans. This point makes no sense. Like, the amount of bills targeting trans people versus the amount of bills targeting gay people proposed by Republican legislatures leans way heavily towards targeting trans people. Same thing with, like, bullying and ostracization, other statistics we have on, like, queer homelessness, queer bullying, etc.
Is that part of the motivation?
Yeah, and I don't think it's always stated up front. And, some people think that that's very implausible. But I think that they don't realise the dynamic in some families and in some cultures, as in, local cultures in the school or whatever. It's really hard to be gender non-conforming, like right bone deep gender non-conforming. I don't mean someone like me who's a fairly normal woman but did a PhD in maths. I mean somebody that everything about your style and your taste and the way you move and your interests just really screams, camp for your boy or butch if you're a girl. And you have to be let a lot of freedom to be yourself, and not a lot, nothing has to be made of this by the grown-ups around you. And if things start to be made about it, you start to question yourself and think, like, why am I so different? Like, why am I a boy who only likes the girls? And why am I a girl who only likes the boys? What's wrong with me? And then the thought comes up in your own mind, was I meant to be a girl? Was I meant to be a boy? Like, we knew this already in about 2000. The research had been done. The papers had been examined. We know that the gender nonconformity comes first in these kids, and the gender dysphoria, the distress, is a result of the gender nonconformity and the meaning that is made of that.
Trans people who are still gender nonconforming post-transition also exist, which disproves this kind of like universal narrative she's trying to show again. Whether or not this person is trans or cis but gender nonconforming, why is one better or worse than the other? Like literally, if somebody understands themselves as a trans girl versus a boy or a gender nonconforming boy, or however you want to word it, why is one better than the other? She can't really point out any reason why.
You just grow up. And you might be an unusual straight person, but you're quite likely to be gay. But if a lot of meaning is made out of it, you interpret that as being that there's a woman inside or there's a man inside. And then the people around you may think that too. And your parents may find this very hard. Like a man who's always wanted a boy to take to the football and, he can, with the best will in the world, he may fail to not seem disappointed.
Yeah.
And the same with the mother who wanted a daughter who went to ballet and to go shopping with and so on, and she gets some little rough and tumble character who just wants tree climbing and rugby. You get the impression that you're a big disappointment to your parents. And this dynamic can unfold.
She's trying to suggest that transitioning is a way to gain the approval of your sexist parents. She's literally trying to insinuate that, like, oh, my sexist parents don't like me because I'm gender nonconforming, but if I were to transition, now my sexist parents would love me again and they would understand me. Sexist parents do not support trans kids. I know that J.K. Rowling has said this exact same point, where she said that, like, she thought about how if she were, like, a trans boy, then she could have been the son that her father said that he always wanted. Newsflash, J.K., your misogynistic father does not want a transgender child. Like the types of bigots that hold on to sexism this hard do not support trans people. They just don't. Like, this point is crazy when you understand how, like, these ideologies tend to intersect. Like, I do not encounter the like the joke about, like, the trans inclusionary radical misogynist or whatever, where it's like, yeah, I support my trans daughter, she belongs in the kitchen. Like, these types really don't exist amongst the bigoted parents. Like, you don't see that as a wide-scale phenomenon.
Between them both. And what you need is family therapy, really, from someone supportive to point this out to you and to guide you gently through. And instead, you end up in a gender clinic and they say, oh, your child's gender identity. Oh, you have a little trans boy, you have a little trans girl.
The first line of defense for anybody that goes to a gender clinic is gender therapy. The WPATH requirements require gender therapy before cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers are given to a trans teenager. Like, literally, you are required to go through gender therapy first, is how the WPATH standards have the system set up. Therapy is their first line. You're just lying about this, Helen.
In the past, you've just said, well, she's a tomboy and you know.
Well, with a girl you would have.
Yes.
Poor old boys. The boys, they tried to straighten them out.
Yes. Yes.
Horrible.
Yes.
But the girls was much easier.
Easier
You just
for
let them
girls.
out, tell them
Yes.
to climb some trees and
Yes.
look back
Yes.
when they're 16.
Yes. I'm perfectly happy to address a trans person by their preferred name and preferred pronouns. I think it's just a matter of politeness, really.
If it's a matter of politeness, then why hasn't he called out Helen, like, being heinous towards every trans person she's talked about? Like, in every instance where Helen heinously misgenders a trans person, like, why hasn't Richard been like, hey, that's pretty rude. Like, it's polite to call people by their names and pronouns. If you genuinely believe that, shouldn't you call her out for all the misgendering she's done so far?
What I object to is the insistence that I am a woman. I mean, you're not a woman. I'm perfectly prepared to call you she if you like, and call you whatever your preferred name is. But to say I am a woman is a debauching of language, and that's where I draw the line.
So how is it a debauching of language? Like, he ultimately settles at the end of his article that a woman is an adult human female free of Y chromosomes, which, first off, there are intersex women who are assigned female at birth, who are largely recognized by the medical community as being more in line with females biologically, who do have Y chromosomes in cases like Swyer syndrome, in cases like complete androgen sensitivity. These would be women with a Y chromosome. Now, at the same time, a trans woman claiming to be a woman is not claiming to have XX chromosomes. She doesn't believe that saying that she's a woman means she has XX chromosomes. What she believes is that she fits into the societal category of womanhood more so than manhood, and that's how she would like to live her life. It's not a debauching of biological reality. Like, you are just delusionally misinterpreting what trans people mean or believe.
Become much more hardline on this, and I would like not to be. I would have started where you are. But what I've learned is that somebody who expects to be called she also expects the words woman and female, and mother,
Yes.
and sister, and daughter. And it's very hard, if you give away sexed language, to explain why this person cannot in all circumstances be treated as a woman. So often people do this preamble. It happens to me less now, but 2 years ago when my book came out, it happened a lot. They would give a preamble to any interview with me in which they said, of course, neither of us is transphobic and we're very happy to use people's names and pronouns and treat you as a woman or treat you as a man.
Oh my gosh, she's just admitting that the mask is slipping. This is crazy.
And I started to think, like, what do you mean by treat somebody as a man or a woman? Because we've got rid of all the unjust and unjustifiable differences between the sexes and the way we treat people now.
Not at all. What? Is she actually saying that sexism has been solved? That people aren't sexist anymore? Wait. If that's the case, then why is parents that weaponize sex-based stereotypes or gender-based stereotypes against their gender nonconforming children a problem? She literally said that feminine boys are treated so horribly, yet she's also now claiming that we solved sexism?
Yeah.
Like, we've equalised pension age.
Is she saying that now that women can own credit cards since, like, the 1970s, that now sexism is solved? We literally acknowledge sexist realities that still exist. It goes beyond just who can own a credit card, Helen.
We've got rid of all that stuff. And now treating somebody as a woman means either I just notice that they're a woman.
Wait. Okay, the implication of her argument here is that when trans women are claiming to be women, what they're saying is that they want to not be allowed to get a credit card. That's what trans women mean when they say that they're women. They want to be treated like a woman. They want to be denied the ability to get a credit card, at least until like the 1970s or whatever. No, that's not what people are talking about. Oh my gosh, that argument is ludicrous.
In a space, like any other space, where it just doesn't actually matter what sex people are. Or it means we're in a single sex space and they shouldn't be there.
We'll come on to that in a moment.
But if you want to try and explain why, you have to use sex-based language. So I have to say the reason this person cannot come in here is because he is a man.
Yes.
And if I say she, I'm already selling the farm.
Did you just walk back his entire point, like, instantly? Oh my gosh. Richard is, like, not even engaged in the conversation. He's just like, see, I think I'm less transphobic than you. And she's like, well, you should be more transphobic. And he's like, I guess you're right. Like, he's not doing anything to investigate the validity of her claims, of her arguments, of her motives, of everything that's she's doing to harm trans people. This is horrible. And also the idea that, like, if you say she, now you cannot, like, do any kind of, like, sex-based segregation. We can talk about, like, sports as an example, where it's like the current policy is that for, like, college sports, the international governing board for a given sport will come up with its own sport-by-sport policy for a given sport on how best to handle intersex athletes, transsexual athletes, etc., to ensure inclusivity and fairness to the best degree possible. You can do that without misgendering anybody. Like, you can say, okay, yes, ma'am, like, we see that you want to play in, like, the women's sports category, but you haven't, like, been transitioning for long enough, so you'll have to, like, wait another year or two while you're still transitioning before this will be, like, fair. Like, you can do that without misgendering anybody.
People who've gone through the ordeal of surgery and being castrated or whatever, and having their breasts removed or whatever, and people who just simply stand up and say, I am a woman or I am a man. It does seem to me that there's almost a sense you sort of paid your dues if you've subjected yourself to. I mean, you're really serious about it. You're really earnest about it. Not just frivolously standing up and saying, I've decided I'm a woman today.
Nobody's just frivolously, like, saying that. That's just not happening. This is just like this is literally just like Gamergate narrative tier misinformation and mischaracterization. Like, nobody just wakes up and is like, I am going to be woman today. I am transgender, call me woman. Like, nobody does that. Trans people think and question and self-doubt about their gender identity for their entire lives because of all the messaging that tells us to just be quote-unquote normal, just be cisgender, just fit in. Like, it is so much work and internalized self-reflection and exploration to overcome this societal messaging and say, I'm going to choose to do this, to be myself, to do what's going to make me happy, in spite of all this messaging that society throws my way. And trans people are overwhelmingly, like, very understanding of, like, people needing to take some time to get used to it and to understand. And there are so many trans people that, like, they don't fully accept themselves until they reach certain milestones of, like, living as a certain gender for an amount of time or being on hormones for a certain amount of time. Like, trans people gatekeep their identity from themselves really hard because of all the messaging we've internalized from society. This notion of people frivolously identifying as transgender is just not true.
I don't make any distinction because I don't think that being a woman or a man is the sort of thing that you pay a price to be.
Yes.
It's just a very base fact about you. But more than that, you know, in a space where a man is not supposed to be...
You don't pay a price to be a man or a woman unless it's, like, intersex people that are coerced into, like, being surgically altered, usually as infants. I mean, they're having to pay a price in order to be a man or a woman, but let's ignore them because they like to ignore intersex people and the actual challenges they face because of transphobic rhetoric and binarizing of gender, which they have to do. Like, this stuff harms intersex people too, and that's heinous.
I don't know whether he's been castrated or not. I'm telling from his secondary sex features, and they don't change if he's been through the surgery. But the other reason is that in international human...
Surgery does not change your secondary sex characteristics. That's what hormones change. I don't know why she thinks that you can't change secondary sex characteristics. Why you can't change to have those female hands through HRT.
Rights law, there can't be any distinction on the basis of whether the person has been castrated, because it's a basic principle that's been adjudicated on now in several courts, is that you can't make something conditional on getting yourself sterilised, because it's human rights abuse to do that.
Yes, that is a human rights abuse to make, like, legal identity or documentation contingent on being sterilized. That fits like the literal United Nations definition of genocide, to require people to be sterilized in order to seek, like, legal recognition or rights.
If you say to people, you know, you've paid your dues if you cut the bits off, and that'll give you the reward is that we'll now treat you as a woman or we'll treat you as a man. you are inducing people to go through a really horrific surgery that is, and to give up
Oh, yes.
something.
Yeah.
So that cannot be a legal line.
No.
And then the last thing I'd say is, like, they paid their dues to whom? Like,
Well, no,
I know,
not.
like, to the other people around them, you
Yes,
know?
yes.
If you come into a women's space, who have you paid your dues
No,
to?
you-
Like,
Is she trying to argue against like the mandation of sterilization or arguing for it? Trans people overwhelmingly are against the requirement of sterilization. Like that, it literally meets the UN's definition of genocide.
no, I've heard it before.
You've shown you're serious about it. You've shown that you're. I mean, somebody who let's talk about sports for a moment. Somebody who's a moderately good swimmer as a man, but kind of mediocre, and then suddenly just says, "I am a woman."
Is he trying to like vague post about Leah Thomas while misgendering her? Because he just said that he will like respect people's names and pronouns. That literally contradicts him saying he would respect someone's names and pronouns. He's misgendering this trans person in this hypothetical. What a liar.
Then allowed to go and break all the records of female swimming.
Leah Thomas has not broken a single record of female swimming. That is just a lie. Even in Leah Thomas's best event, Katie Ledecky, a cisgender woman, still holds the world record by numerous seconds over Leah Thomas. Like it's a huge lead between Katie Ledecky's world record time and Leah Thomas's best time. What a weaselly freaking liar, dude. So true.
That seems to me to be unserious. You're,
Yes, it is entirely unserious because it's not happening. Leah Thomas has not broken a single record in women's swimming. That's just not true.
saying you're a woman because you want to say you're a woman. Whereas if you've been through the surgery,
But he's still not a woman. And
but there's a sort of feeling that he really means it. He's sincere about it.
I mean, I could say I was sincere about being astronaut. It doesn't make me an astronaut, and the surgery doesn't make any difference to your sporting performance.
It's hormones that make a difference on your sporting performance, not surgery. Like the policies that allow transgender inclusion in certain sports are based off of hormone therapy, not based off of surgery, not based off of self-ID. Like they're literally based off of hormones. Them claiming that like self-ID ruins women's sports is just completely false when we look at the actual sports policies, is that they're based off of hormones. They're not based off of self-ID, they're not based off of surgery. We're ignoring the actual reality.
what it is to be female in a sports category, which we are. That's how sports categories work. You know, we protect under 18s,
yes.
over 35s, Paralympians, flyweights.
Yeah.
The thing that we're protecting is femaleness. And the fact that a man is very, very serious in wishing to be seen as female doesn't move his category.
No, that's true.
Right, it's based on hormones, and it's based off of, like, when you transition. For people that, like, get really hung up on the trans sports issue, or they think that, like, no trans person should ever compete in sports, think about the puberty blocker group. So if a trans person blocks puberty at the onset of puberty, say, like, a trans woman, she would never go through male puberty. She would never develop in a male puberty fashion, such as she would never obtain any kind of unfair biological advantage that may or may not even exist after hormone suppression later in life. She would never develop the thing that they're concerned about. And so excluding all trans people, when we recognize that trans women who have been on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones have no biological mechanism by which they would have an unfair advantage, is completely crazy, and it's just motivated by anti-trans bigotry.
Okay, let's take the example of the astronaut that you just mentioned. Just say, I'm an astronaut, and you're obviously not. But if, on the other hand, you've gone through the rigorous training of an astronaut, and you've put yourself through all the it's really rather a hard graft to become an astronaut. You've proved you're serious about it.
But I've also become an astronaut. So that's the thing.
You might be not good enough to become an astronaut, but you've
then
tried.
then I would not be an astronaut.
No, you wouldn't be an astronaut, but you've tried.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that male and female are prizes for effort. They're just observations of categories that we are.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it keeps the numbers down. There's that.
Yes.
But, for a long time, we didn't see like men who identified as trans in women's sports because they did set a surgery rule. And at the time, the surgery was really only done on people in their 40s and older.
Why are we talking? That's just not true. The Olympics have allowed trans people to compete in the sports of the gender they identify with hormone suppression, for literal decades now. Like, the Olympics has allowed this for decades. And there has never been a trans person to win a single Olympic medal. You can look this up. Actually, if you do Google it, you might encounter some misinformation, because there was a non-binary person who did win a medal in the women's, I think it was like women's soccer. But this non-binary person, they were AFAB. They never medically transitioned. They played in the same sport of the sex they were assigned at birth. There has never been somebody who has medically transitioned, gone into the opposite sex sport, and won an Olympic medal. That has never happened.
So you didn't see any prime-aged men?
Yeah, that's right. The IOC rules for trans people competing were set in 2000 for the Sydney Games. This has been going on for more than 2 decades now, and we still have not had a single trans person win an Olympic medal in a cross-sex sport league.
But many of the sporting bodies require that you lower your testosterone. And I mean, honestly...
So now we're acknowledging the reality that it's not based off of self-ID, it's not based off of surgery, it's based off of hormone testing. Okay, so why are we fear-mongering about self-ID when that's not how it works?
It's just a paper rule, it's not a real one. Younger men can identify as...
What do you mean they don't check that? Leah Thomas literally had her hormone levels monitored so she could be able to compete. They literally do check this. What are you talking about?
Women, and so now we're actually seeing men who are, pretty good athletes and who are then world record breakers as women.
Who? Where? Can you name it? Because this is not happening.
But it's all wrong. Like, if we're protecting the female category, then no male advantage belongs in it. It's that simple.
If we're going to have separate female athletic competitions at all, then
yeah. And if we don't...
They're also never going to acknowledge what do we do about, like, intersex people competing in sports. Because, like, this issue is nuanced and complicated. And ultimately, like, even if trans people don't exist, the discrete categorization of male and female sports has messy edge cases where there's intersex people who, what category we put them in, might be unfair in either direction. Athletes who used to be doping but are no longer doping, they might still have an unfair biological advantage. Should they be allowed to compete after they've stopped doping for X amount of years? Look, it's complicated, it's nuanced. We should let sports medicine scientists handle this rather than just lying and speculating and spreading anti-trans rhetoric.
There will be no women who win anything.
Yes, I mean, you could say everything's open. You're just a human, and you go in for everything, and then, as you say, women wouldn't win
anything.
Yes, maybe gymnastics.
But gymnastics is an interesting example because male and female gymnastics are very different. Like, the one thing that women really have an advantage in is flexibility.
Yes.
But male gymnastics, yes, they're flexible, but mostly they're strong. So they do very different things. They just do different events for the men and women. Neither sex would be any good in the others in gymnastics.
Yes.
I don't think that'd be true, but I mean, like, I don't think people are advocating for, like, one single weight class, sex class, etc. of all sports. Like, we don't group, like, boxers, where it's like one boxer weighs, like, less than 100 pounds, and the other boxer is, like, a 400-pound beast. Like, we don't group them together in competition. Like we can have nuanced policies. This is what sports medicine scientists want. They don't want, like, a one universal league for any sport.
There's a lot in your book about changing rooms, so we better talk about that. Tell us a bit about that.
He's literally like, tell us how, like, trans people ruin changing rooms. What a conversation.
I understand that you need female-only spaces if they're crisis centres. Or, really specialist services. But they think, like, oh, what about public toilets and maybe even changing rooms, like, have cubicles?
Trans women do need access to crisis shelters, too. Trans women are overwhelmingly victimized by men in the same way that cis women are. And, like, they also need access to crisis centers that are going to be safe for them. Like, you can make a crisis center that's safe and inclusive for both trans and cis women, but we're going to ignore that, okay.
And they miss the point that these are sort of mass arrangements for the convenience of the half of humanity that experience at the hands of the other half of humanity, that experiences the two most common sex crimes, which are voyeurism and exhibitionism, and are just, they're an inclusion measure for women.
Do you have any evidence that, like, gender-neutral bathrooms have increased assault? Like, is there any evidence that exists? Or are we just fear-mongering about trans people?
Toilets were brought in so that women didn't experience what was called the urinary leash, which meant that women had to stay near the home because they needed to be able to go. And, I mean, women have to take off clothing from the bottom half of them to go to the toilet. Men don't. You're quite vulnerable when you're weeing. And so women in the Victorian era, like, would have to always be able to be aware that there was somewhere they could go to wee, otherwise they could get assaulted. And it was the factory girls, actually, who campaigned for the first public toilets, because they were getting assaulted if they tried to wee during a factory day. They weren't able to work outside the home.
Is she really insinuating that if we have gender-neutral toilets, that people are just going to start being assaulted at unprecedented rates again? I don't know the truth about the statistics she's talking about, but the reality of bathrooms back then versus the reality of bathrooms now are very different. And in places we're increasingly seeing gender-neutral bathrooms implemented, and I don't think there's an increase in sexual assault. I mean, are there statistics on this? Analyses of criminal incident reports have found no evidence that assaults, sex crimes, or voyeurism in public toilets are increased by gender-neutral toilets or sexuality and gender-diverse inclusive policies. Furthermore, trans youth are more likely to be the victim of sexual assault than the perpetrators. Oh, okay, so we're just literally lying. Got
The
it.
special situations that women need, just ordinary spaces like toilets and changing rooms for, like women menstruate.
Why do you need a separate space for that? Yes, people do menstruate. Why do you need a separate space for the menstruators? Isn't she like reinventing, like, okay, all of these like TERFy types like to claim that like language about like menstruation is like dehumanizing women or whatever, but she's literally just saying we need a separate space for the menstruators. Like she's literally doing the bit. But also like you could just have gender neutral bathrooms and you can put a box of tampons and pads in the gender neutral bathroom, and people who menstruate can get those products, and people that don't menstruate are not interested in taking tampons and pads for themselves. It's that simple.
Said women take off more of their clothes to go to the toilet. We take much longer.
Wait, is she trying to say that we need separate spaces for women's toilets because women take longer to pee? What? What kind of argument is that? If the men go pee next to a woman in a gender neutral bathroom, then it doesn't work because the man is done peeing first? What? What kind of argument is that?
Girls are at risk. Like if you're a man who's out with your daughter who's 6, 7, 8, 9, and you want to send her to the toilet, you want to be able to pop her into the women's loos and know that there's only women in there, because she's really at risk, actually.
It is exceptionally common for young kids of either gender to be escorted by their parents into whatever bathroom their parents use. Like, it is exceptionally common for a dad with a little girl to just take her little girl into the men's restroom and to watch over her so she can go pee. It is exceptionally common for women, mothers that have young children, to take even their young boys into the women's restroom just to go pee and get out. Like, it is so common for young children to go into the opposite gender bathroom because that's the gender their parents are, and the parent, like, watches over their kid. I'm also sure that a lot of, like, parents are going to feel more comfortable taking their kid of the opposite gender into the bathroom with them rather than just sending them off into the bathroom unsupervised. That's why parents do this, because they know and feel that it's safer to be watching over their kid. Like, this argument just ignores literal reality of how parents take care of their kids.
Then there's Muslim women, and there's women who have been raped, who are survivors of sexual assault, and who can have really serious flashbacks in enclosed spaces if there are males there with them.
Serious flashbacks in enclosed spaces if there's males there with them. If you go into your own stall, close the door in like a gender neutral bathroom, because this is how these places work, there's not a man enclosed there with you. Like, you get your own separate stall. That's how gender neutral bathrooms work.
And now we're losing all of these spaces. They're either going gender neutral or they're going self-ID. Like, they'll put a sign up saying, use whichever space you feel most comfortable in. And about a year ago at Sex Matters, where I work with Maya Forstater now, we put out a call for evidence as to why people cared about single-sex spaces. And we did hear stories about specialist spaces like rape crisis centres, but mostly we heard about toilets and changing rooms.
So wait, they just surveyed transphobes? That's what the evidence is they're seeking?
People wrote us almost essays about it. They said, I went along to my local swimming pool, and there's a bloke who calls himself a woman who's now using the changing room. And I've never told anybody. I'm in my 50s now, but I was raped when I was 14, and I never told anybody. And I found myself in this enclosed space, and I looked around, and there was this bloke, and I froze, and I remembered everything terrible that had happened to me, and I left, and I never went back.
Triggering trauma is a bad thing. What this woman needs is therapy, not transphobia. Weaponizing transphobia is going to worsen her fears and triggers and problems with this very real bad experience she's experienced. What she needs is therapy to be able to cope and to be able to overcome triggers and to be able to exist in society. Like, this woman needs therapy, not transphobia. And trying to say that, like, and like the type of transphobic rhetoric that Helen is stirring up makes these real trauma victims worse. And let's be clear, they were traumatized by a cis man, not a trans woman. And so we're targeting the wrong group of people with somebody's untreated trauma, and we're making their untreated trauma worse by fear-mongering about their untreated trauma.
So women are being pushed out of public spaces again by the loss of these spaces that were introduced in order that we could play a full part in public life.
It's not that trans people are pushing them out of the public space, it's the trauma. If your trauma is interfering with you existing in a public space, you need therapy. And therapy is a really great tool for being able to exist in a public space after you've been traumatized.
Before we started, which I didn't know, that competitive swimmers, but Olympic type swimmers, have to wriggle into their streamlined swimsuits, and so they don't just sort of quickly put it on the way the rest of us do. How long does it take?
Like, it can take up to 40 minutes. So I didn't know this when I wrote the book, or I would have put it in. So at the time I was writing the book, there were a few athletes who were making it into elite women's sport who were men. So Laurel Hubbard was the big example at the time, who's a weightlifter, a New Zealand weightlifter, a man in his 40s.
Laurel Hubbard did compete in the Olympics in female weightlifting, and she placed dead last. The trans woman that we're trying to fearmonger about, she literally placed dead last in her event. So, once again, like, trans women are not dominating.
But in between the hardback and the paperback, along came Leah Thomas, who's a young man who's...
Why would you just dead name Leah Thomas like that? Like, what does that even add to the conversation? Like, that's just mean. Like, people can change their names, Helen. Are we really objecting to, like, somebody changing their name legally? What's the problem with that? If the problem is, like, biological reality or whatever, do you think that, like, a dead name is a biological name? Like, what's biological about names, Helen? Dead naming is completely logically devoid and morally reprehensible. Like, holy shit, she just wants to harass Leah. Like, that's literally it.
6'4", who's about 21, 22, and who started swimming in American college races. And I mean, it's bad enough when you look, like, you see people in their swimsuits, you can see who's a man and who's a woman, and he's really towering over the women. And he doesn't have good technique. You know, he's just using his shoulder strength and not even kicking his legs, and he still wins.
What? Trying to say that Leah Thomas was not a good swimmer. By the way, Leah Thomas was, like, very competitive in the men's league, even before she transitioned. Like, the narrative that Leah Thomas was, like, not a nobody in swimming and then transitioned. Leah Thomas was actually doing very well for a freshman, and was ranked pretty well for a freshman, such that, like, the trajectory of her improvement in sports was not at all out there or crazy. Also, her best times as a man were still better than her best times as a woman, like, after transitioning. Yeah, she was, like, a regular top 8 competitor. The people that cite that she was ranked, like, 400th or whatever, that was, like, after she started transitioning for a year. So when she was starting HRT, but still competing in the men's division, she dropped to, like, rank 400 something. But her freshman year, she was actually ranked, it was about, like, 80th. I have the stats in my research doc. She was ranked 89th in her freshman year. Then in her sophomore year, after she started HRT, but still competing in the men's division, she dropped 400 ranks because HRT decimated her physicality. And then she was ranked 31st in the women's division by her senior year. And going from 89th to 31st over a 4-year training period is actually pretty standard for college athletes who train consistently and who perform well.
And then I heard one of the young women who had to compete against him describing what it is like doing competitive swimming. So they wear these streamlined suits, and they're compression suits that, like, just make you very cut through the water fast, and it's very, very hard to get on. And the compression doesn't last all that long, so you change suit every time you race, and you also don't wear that suit when you're doing your warm-up. And there's dozens of events, you know, all the different lengths and strokes, and there's maybe many competitors in all of them. They have these big open changing rooms, and you're running in, you strip completely naked, you put on your practice suit, you go out, you do your warm-up, you come back in, you strip completely naked again, and then you start this miserable business of shimmying into your race suit, which is incredibly tight, and you have to sort of wriggle and bounce and get it up over your hips, and then wriggle and bounce yourself in completely naked through all of this, and all around you everyone else is doing the same thing. And there's this 6'4" bloke. And in case anyone wants to know, no, he has not had surgery.
Why are you looking at her penis? If you're changing next to someone, why are you looking at her penis? Why would you do that? Like, just don't look at someone's penis. Like, just, like, if you're bothered, just stare off into the corners. Like, stop looking at people's penises. That's weird. You're being so weird complaining about... So I was looking at this person's penis in a changing room and I got upset. Like, my question to you is, why are you looking at her penis? What?
And no, there are not cubicles, and no, you cannot hold a towel in your way. And that's what you're doing. And these poor girls, like the girls on his own team at the university that he's at, but all the women who had to compete against him, if they complained, they were told that they were bigots. Riley Gaines, who's the one of them who's spoken out the most.
Yeah, Riley Gaines is a grifter, for those that haven't seen her stuff before. We've covered some of her stuff on this channel before. She placed 5th in the swimming competition, actually tying Leah Thomas for 5th place in her best event. And then she decided to make a career out of being transphobic, because she wasn't a good enough swimmer to make a career out of being a swimmer. She placed 5th. That's her story, basically. But, like, Riley, stop looking at Leah's penis. Like, mind your own business.
She kept talking about it. She would not be taken on to medical school.
Because you should not be looking at people's penises and then complaining about them. Like, that's actually really bad and gross behavior.
Told she's a bigot by somebody senior in the university.
Yeah, by the sports team, by the EDI team in the university, EDI meaning equity.
This is a phenomenon that you'll notice, is that the transphobic grifters that make a career out of losing a women's sports competition and then creating a whole transphobic grifting career out about it, they're always terrible athletes. Like, it's always the person that places, like, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. It's never the people that place 1st or 2nd, because those people are actually good at sports, can actually make a career out of sports. Another one of these common ones was another transphobic grifter who competed in a sports competition. It was a sports competition run by, I think it was like Red Bull or Monster Energy or something like that. It was like an independent competition where they could set their own rules because it wasn't like an internationally sanctioned event or whatever. And this person that went on a transphobic grift about losing to a trans woman also lost to a literal child at the same event. She placed horribly in the event, lost to a literal child who was like 12 years old or whatever, and then went on to complain that it was trans women that had the unfair advantage when she couldn't beat a literal child.
Told that they'll be referred for counselling?
Yes, if you have a problem with looking at your teammate's penis and then getting mad about looking at your teammate's penis in the locker room, you should probably talk to a counselor or a therapist about why you have such a problem with looking at other people's penises and getting upset about it.
To cope with losing, basically.
It was about the penis incident, not about losing. What? This was about how she kept on looking at Leah's penis and then got mad that she kept on looking at Leah's penis. This wasn't about her losing. Her transphobic grift on, like, making a conservative political career out of it, that was about her losing. Just like the skateboarder that lost to a literal child, but, you know, we're talking about different things here.
This is also one-sided. I realise there are two different points of view here, but how has one side managed to kind of capture the dominant dialogue, really, the dominant half of the dialogue?
Yeah.
And constantly it comes up that if you dissent from that, you're called a bigot, and so people don't want to dissent because dissent, and so I don't want to call it cowardice, but it's pardonable cowardice because nobody wants to be called a bigot. But why does all the abuse go one way?
Is he insinuating that trans people are not abused or bullied by TERFs and other transphobic people? That's literal insanity. If you look at any of the statistics on trans bullying, if you look at literally a Twitter comment thread about a trans person posting about, like, hi, I am really happy and I love my life and I'm a mother and I love my children. The amount of transphobic abuse that someone's going to get in the comment sections from something as benign as that are insane. You can look at the comment sections under my Twitter, especially about any of the stuff about, like, being a mom, and the amount of hate I get is so vitriolic and so dehumanizing and so heinous. He literally doesn't think that trans people are bullied for being trans. That is crazy.
Why does all the bullying go one way?
I mean, there are so many different answers to that, and, you know, like, I think they all reinforce each other. And one of them is because this is a linguistic movement, and there is no sense in which Leah Thomas is a woman except that you say he is.
What about her hormone levels? What about that? Like that's what the sports committees that had the policies in play literally verify, that her hormone levels were in line with women.
The only way in which you can keep the fiction going. If people can say what they see in front
Only
of them.
way in which he can keep the fiction going. But why does he have these abettors and accomplices who...
Yes.
Richard just misgendered Leah, like, explicitly. Like, we're now not even vague posting about Leah Thomas anymore. Now we're actually talking about Leah Thomas directly, and he just misgendered her. He literally said he would respect trans people's names and pronouns.
I mean, you can't ignore the fact that this is for the benefit of men.
Naomi TikTok.
You know, like, female sports has always been fifth rate. Like, it gets much less funding.
Why would somebody transitioning want to go into a sports league that has less funding if it's just about, like, exploiting people for money?
They're told things that nobody would tell a male athlete, like that, you know, it's for the joy of taking part. Yeah. Why do you care about winning? I think in America, it's become so associated with the very, very polarized political system. So, you know, and everyone tends to take their political opinions as a package. That's not an American fault solely. But in America, it's so polarized that they're really very specific packages. And if you want not to take the opinion that gender identity trumps sex, then you're a Republican, you have to be a conservative Christian, you have to be anti-abortion, you have to think that women belong in the...
Okay, this gender identity trumps sex as in, like, we can never, like, use sex in any kind of context like a doctor's office, or if we're like trying to determine sports eligibility. This is insanity that like overwhelmingly trans people do not believe. We are creating the most easily destroyed straw man of what trans people believe, such that it doesn't even reflect what a lot of trans people actually believe in order to attack. Like, she has to attack a straw man because she has nothing real to go on.
And so if you don't want those things, well, you've got to come over here and give up women's sports and say that men can be women and say that, you know, there can be a female penis and so on.
Once you understand the feminine penis, like, it's all over. Like, you're finally in the know. Like, people that actually understand the feminine penis or the masculine pussy, it's beautiful. It's beautiful when you get it. I gotta say. Like, I have become a true believer after understanding and encountering this, and it's fascinating. Humans are fascinating. Also, like, hormones do literally alter how your genitals function, smell, taste, behave, etc., sensations. Like, all this stuff actually is objectively changed by hormones, too.
You look at a giraffe or a platypus or something and you say, how did this come to be? You could answer that by sort of going back. I mean, I think you did this in your beautiful book. Which one was it? The one where you go back in the Tree of Life backwards, quite thick one.
Oh, The Ancestor's Tale.
That's lovely. Yes, that book. So you can go back and you can actually answer that question, or you can just say, look, that's how evolution works. Yeah. You know, so we have this is an emerging ideology. Some would say neo-religion. And out of the many, many bizarre things that people could believe, this is the one that made it. And you could then point at, you know, the internet, the arrival of sex change surgery, the fact that we're all online too much, social media places where kids congregate without adults and talk to each other without adult oversight, the cowardice of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, which is a dreadfully corrupt organisation. I mean,
is she saying sexual reproduction is a thing? But then trans people are denying that sexual reproduction is a thing? Because, like, I acknowledge sperm, ovary, fuse together, form a zygote, human baby. I don't think that womanhood is just the same thing and can be solely defined as egg boss, pussy girl, pop off, feminine queen. Like, there's a lot more to womanhood than just, like, having a pussy or eggs. And I hope that Helen would agree with that.
You know, it allowed the cheating by the East German women dopers to go on in full sight for 20 years and has never sorted that out and never taken the medals away from them. You know, they just don't care. The show keeps on the road as far as they're concerned. So there's just all these different things that happened, and, you know, the result is what we see, as opposed to me being able to say, I would have been able to predict this in advance. I'd never have predicted the platypus either.
And corporations are a platypus.
The platypus wasn't believed when it was first sent to the museum.
Well, exactly. So this is a platypus in a way.
Yes.
What? How is this a platypus? I don't get it.
I get it. Platypus is a metaphor for whatever's keeping you down.
She's saying that, like, a lot of things cause people to believe in the validity of trans people, and that she sees trans people as some kind of, like, anomaly. It's kind of dehumanizing. And at the same time, just, like, people recognize that gender is more complicated than just, like, pussy, penis. It's not a platypus. It's just, like, it's more than just genitals, I guess. Like, can't we just take that?
LGBT.
Yes.
Is the T a little bit more... I mean, is there some opposition between the LGB on the one hand and the T on the other?
I mean, depends who you ask and depends what you think these are. If you think these are identities, and especially if you think in American identities. So in the American way of thinking, there is the, you know, the white supremacist, the cishet white male who runs the world and everybody else is oppressed by that person. And the more ways in which you're oppressed, kind of the better in this culture. Then LGBTQIA++, you know, all of those things are, you know, you're not cishet.
Yes.
Meaning cis and heteronorm.
I think that, like, the reason we came up with LGBT as an acronym was to play Oppression Olympics. Because that's crazy. Largely, the reason why the acronym was spun together is because it's largely the same system, which harms both gay and trans people. Largely, it's the system of societal expectation or enforcement of gender roles, including, like, who you should date based off of your gender. And so society's saying, because you're a boy, you have to present as a boy, identify as a boy, date women, etc. It's all the same fight against sexist gendered expectations. And so that's why LGBT came together, because we're all trying to fight those sexist gendered expectations that harm us all.
On the other hand, if you actually just think that LGB is a shorthand for people who aren't heterosexual, that people who are either homosexual or bisexual, and you understand those as people who have unusual sexualities, which, you know, has been until very recently.
Unusual sexualities? If we go back to like our earliest accounts of human sexuality in like early human societies, it seemed that being bisexual was actually relatively standard or normal, that like most people tend to skew more so towards bisexuality or slight like heterosexuality preference. They're really not all that unusual unless we demonize them, which is what people like her accomplish.
Sent to jail, given electric shocks, cast out by their families, like really bad things.
Oh, like the kind of things that trans people still face today? Are we going to say anything about that?
What the hell is T doing in there?
Yes.
Like T is an identity, it's not a sexuality. And more than that, T is an identity that undermines the very basis of sexuality. Because if you're trans, you move category, or in your mind you move category from male to female, and that means you change sexuality as well. So a straight man becomes a lesbian.
How is that a problem for the word lesbian existing? Like if you went from being a straight man to a lesbian trans woman, but you stayed attracted to women the whole time, how is that a problem for the category of lesbian?
And that's not very much what most lesbians find very helpful for their...
No, I mean,
there are plenty of women who identify as lesbians, including cisgender women, who are perfectly happy dating trans women, and they still understand their identity as being a lesbian woman. So if there are cases, plenty of cases, of lesbians who are attracted to trans women, then yes, it seems to be the case that trans women can be included in the category of lesbian, because that just matches the descriptive reality of how lesbians engage and experience with their sexuality. Also, all the research we have on sexual attraction has found that time and time again, people's sexual attraction is based off of attraction to both gendered characteristics as well as attraction to sex characteristics. Whether or not people prioritize attraction to gendered characteristics or sex characteristics or other characteristics, personality characteristics, is just going to largely depend on the person.
Do feel threatened, I think, don't they?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
How is that threatening? How is it threatening to be like, there might be a lesbian that has like different tastes than me? Like that would be like saying that because some lesbians are attracted like femme lesbians, while other lesbians are attracted like butch lesbians, like the existence of one threatens the existence of the other. That's not true. Like there are some lesbians that love girl dick and there are some lesbians that don't. That's okay.
It works both ways, like a lot of things to do with sex.
Some lesbians love straps, some lesbians don't wear straps, some, like, there are lots of different ways to be a lesbian, and that's okay.
You know, formally it works both ways. Like a woman who identifies as a man, like a straight woman who identifies as a man, becomes a gay man. And this is increasingly popular among teenage girls, to identify as gay men. I think they're not going to have much success when they get older. It's not going to go very well because that's not how gay culture works.
There are plenty of gay men that also love boy pussy. You would be surprised, Helen.
But men who are bigger, stronger, more sexually aggressive, you know, lesbians are the people who've always found it hardest to keep their footing in the alphabet soup. Like, I have a lot of lesbian friends now doing this work, and they'll tell you that the LGB groupings never paid attention to their needs. They paid attention to gay men's needs. And so now a lesbian-only group will usually find itself under pressure to admit heterosexual men who think of themselves as lesbians.
Where is that happening? How is, like, a material problem that lesbian women face complicated by some trans women also being lesbians? Largely, overwhelmingly, trans people are also staunch feminists that would support other causes of queer rights. The idea of, like, trans people not supporting lesbians and their rights just does not match the reality of how trans people actually believe and advocate for the rights of other people.
There's a very common male sexual interest, a fetish, in cross-dressing, and that there are significant numbers of men who find it very sexy to think of themselves as lesbians. Probably as many of those as there are actual lesbians.
Did she say that there is as many cross-dressing men as actual lesbians? That's kind of a crazy statement to just say. We are doing the AGP argument. We can talk about, like, cross-dressers. We can talk about, like, trans women. If something was just, like, a sexual kink, or like a cross-dressing kink, you wouldn't transition. Like, men who have cross-dressing kinks don't transition because it's just a kink. They don't want to be a woman in their everyday lives. They just want to cross-dress or do some kind of, like, kink play with gender.
Come into your spaces and now it's not a lesbian space anymore.
What lesbian space is, like, harmed by, like, a trans woman existing in there too? How is a lesbian space harmed by a trans woman's existence? I don't, like, she doesn't have anything.
I've been politically on the left all my life, and I find myself now being blamed somehow. I find that people think I must be right-wing because the only people who agree with me about this tend to be politically on the right. That's not really true, but they often think it is.
Overwhelmingly, transphobia is a position taken by the right and not the left.
There's a very significant movement here in the UK on the left of the women who came up through the unions.
She's talking about TERFs here, and TERFs are not on the left by any means. Often, like, TERFs are just misandrists who want to weaponize gender roles against people they don't like. It's not progressive politics. And we can see time and time again all of the TERFs abandoning fights for access to like abortion protections, TERFs abandoning literally every major feminist fight in order to hyper focus on transphobia. Like time and time again, when progressive causes are brought to the forefront, TERFs ignore them or sacrifice them in order to just be transphobic.
And so I think here in the UK, it's really easy to say, oh, look at Woman's Place UK. I mean, J.K. Rowling, look at her. She's not exactly right-wing. So, you know, it is often said, but it's an American thing to say. It's because of the American polarization, and it's part of the Americanization of everywhere.
I should have said that. That's American.
Oh, but it gets said to us too. I mean, I get told that I'm funded by the Heritage Foundation.
Are you getting money from the Heritage Foundation? When I was at the Heritage Foundation, I was honored to be able to host 2 groundbreaking... Yeah, she literally has worked at the Heritage Foundation. She's saying people are calling me like a right-wing bigot who has worked with the Heritage Foundation, when she literally has.
Groups.
Yes, people are saying you've worked with the Heritage Foundation because it's true.
I'm not. You know, it's a joke among the women, that I work with. You know, people are always saying, "Have you got any of your far right money yet? Like, it must be stuck in the post." You know, no, we haven't. We don't get funding from them.
You literally work with the Heritage Foundation, though. What a Weasley little liar, dude.
It is very irritating, and I suppose I find it less irritating because I never thought of myself as either left or right wing. Mm-hmm. I wasn't even a left wing student politician. I've always been a very include me out person. Like, I've voted for every party, every one of the 3 main parties here. Honestly, don't know who I could vote for now. But you will find that in this movement, the people who are willing to speak on this issue,
the people that say that rhetoric is like often very conservative leaning. Oh yeah, for those that don't know about the Heritage Foundation, the Heritage Foundation is a Christo-fascist think tank that essentially they will hire quack doctors, researchers, etc., to figure out, first off, both publishing articles that just like spread far-right culture war narratives, and they also will like do research into what kind of far-right rhetoric rouses up the voter base the most. So like they will do like focus groups where they'll be like, okay, does homophobia rile people up? Does racism rile people up? Does transphobia rile people up? Like, what gets conservative bigots mad enough that they're going to go to the polls? They're a group that does this kind of research and this kind of funding.
Are often people who have been through some crucible beforehand. And those can be good, bad, or indifferent things as far as I'm concerned. Lots of Brexiteers, lots of anti-vaxxers, lots of evangelical Christians.
Is she saying that anti-vaxxers are on her side? That's funny. Yeah, of course they would holistically, like, ignore science and medical literature.
I've had some formative experience, like, I think, probably you sticking with atheist rationalism while the new atheist movement degenerated into gender woo. You know, you've already been cast out in some way. And if you've already been cast out, well, you've got used to it. You know what it's like.
Speaking positively of anti-vaxxers, of course she's pretty conservative.
You know that you can survive it. And so I do see a lot of very varied people who have already experienced being cast out.
Well, we'd probably better come to a close.
All of those are just examples of people who are very socially conservative. Okay, so now we're just going to like spew off her bullshit at the end and promote her organization. Let's see what they're about. Our mission: to promote clarity about sex and law, policy, and language in order to... Oh, okay. So they want to promote like those bills that essentially like legally define trans people out of having any kind of rights with respect to their gender identity. Got it. Okay. That was Richard Dawkins just literally handing her a silver platter of a platform to spew transphobia without question, without challenge, without asking to see any kind of evidence. And that's dangerous and scary.